welcome. Happy World Food Day. Today I have a fantastic guest for you, Dr. Michelle Perro. She is one of the best pediatricians in the United States. She actually got ranked amongst America's top pediatricians. She's had an incredible medical career. Dr. Perro, I understand you started your education at Yale. You moved to Mount Sinai for medical school. Then you worked in big city hospitals in New York City and in a children's hospital in Oakland. And so all of that happened before I became aware of you. I guess I met you first when you had a private practice. You were doing down to earth pediatrics. That was
Yes.
your private practice.
Yes.
And
Yes, a long career, but here I am in environmental health. My first steps were in pediatric emergency medicine, and you've
wow.
got the history correct.
Well, it's very impressive. I did want to ask, like, where along the line did you realize that something was up environmentally that you had to pay attention to in order to help the kids that you're working with? Because I've only known you since you've been doing GMO science and writing books like What's Making Our Children Sick. So I know you in this realm, but you had a career before that in regular hospitals, doing conventional medicine. Somewhere along the line, you became a homeopath. Where did this change happen?
So, as most things happen in life, Alexis, it was a combination of need and serendipity and sort of me staying curious and awake. I became a homeopath because my own son had challenges, which we solved homeopathically. But I had this serendipitous encounter with an MD homeopath at that time. Her name is Dr. Ikenze. And I wound up eventually working for her once I got my degree. So I started to make the pivot. I went into initially, I opened my own integrative urgent care. So I was so kind of, let's say, dissatisfied with the way mainstream medicine was managing even acute issues. I opened my own urgent care, down to earth pediatrics. And what was coming in were kids with complex chronic health challenges. And around 2000, I started seeing this uptick in gut disturbances, leaky gut, constipation, and cognitive dysfunction and autism was clicking up. And I thought, what the heck is going on? Am I just having to see more, or they're seeking me out? So did a little bit of a deep dive, but then serendipity knocked on my door again. And lo and behold, one of the moms I was working with, we were stopping the spray in Northern California, said, Michelle, read Jeffrey Smith's book. See, Deception and Being a Dutiful Pediatrician. I read that book. That was a gal named Lisa Krause, gave me the book. And my world flipped because through Jeffrey, thank you, Jeffrey, I learned about the work of Dr. Arpad Pusti, the first scientist to study GMOs. And he eventually got booted out of his institution of 37 years when he reported they were harmful to rats' health. He studied GMOs without their associated pesticides. Most of the data that comes out now is combined. There are only about 3 studies looking at GMOs without their glyphosate-based herbicides or other herbicides now. And once I saw that, it was no turning back. And then I began this journey on environmental health, food as medicine, GMOs and pesticides, hence GMO science. We're in our 10th year. It's hard to believe. And all the other things that you and I can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, you're really on the cutting edge. When you started being concerned about these things, were there many other people that you could talk to in your field, or did you really have to blaze this course? Because you're one of the only doctors, or at a time, you were one of the only doctors I knew of who was saying the word GMO. And you mentioned Jeffrey Smith, and for anyone who hasn't seen Secret Ingredients, Dr. Perro is featured in that film, and it is a must watch.
Thank you, Alexis. Unfortunately not. I mean, at that time I was still very vested in talking to my colleagues, and I've known the pediatricians in my area. I'm in Northern California, and saying, hey, what do you guys think? What do you think? What about the food? What about other things other than food where kids are getting increased toxicity? And it was sort of like the sea of apathy. I thought, like, I know you guys are seeing it too. And there was this weak theory going around that we were better at diagnosing these things. That was absolute garbage because your grandma can diagnose autistic spectrum. It's not difficult. And I said, no, that's not it. We're not better diagnosticians. We're seeing more. And as you know, since I was a young buck at Bellevue, 1 in 10,000 kids on the spectrum here in California, it's 1 in 22. 2 counties are actually going down in California, rates of autism. Only two, Marin and Sonoma counties. And that we can talk about that, but still clicking up. It was sort of a sea of deaf ears. And Alexis, I was actually stupefied at that time thinking, why wouldn't we have more interest? And Western or conventional medicine, whatever you like to call it, had literally no tools to help these chronically complex ill children. And we were seeing multiple autistic kids in a family, and all these kids, approximately 90%, have concomitant gut issues. Where are all these gut issues coming from? We were seeing leaky gut, where there's permeability of the gut and abnormally, incompletely broken down proteins cross this sensitive gut barrier, and all those toxicants go up right up into the brain, across the brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier. And so there was sort of this dearth of interest, or don't know what was going on, but I knew I had to make a shift, and I did align myself with integrated practitioners, chiropractors, naturopathic doctors, DOs, acupuncturists, and I literally trained myself become a naturopathic doctor, and homeopath is what I did. I did get my degree in homeopathy, but I took lots of classes, lots of courses to learn. I hate the word natural, but holistic health.
Well, you've created a wonderful resource for parents, but I think for anyone, because when I read your book, What's Making Our Children Sick, it's a blueprint for what's happening to everyone's health. I guess, like you were saying, because these toxins cross the blood-brain barrier, children are a lot more vulnerable because they're already more permeable that way than adults. And also thinking now about the timeline you're describing. So you were basically noticing the effects of GMOs as they came into the market and as the children were born into this environment, because the major GMOs that are still the major GMOs, I mean, people imagine we've got GMOs for better nutrition, and we've got GMOs for climate change, we've got GMOs for all of these good things, but really the only GMOs that have ever been commercialized that are significant are the ones that work with pesticides, the Roundup Ready crops that tolerate excess amounts of glyphosate, Monsanto's Roundup, and then we've got the crops, the BT crops, the ones that produce their own insecticides. And then, of course, those were matched with the neonicotinoids, the insecticides that kill bees, and the organophosphates. And like, yeah, we've had a big toxic soup since the late 1990s. And so basically, you notice this, like the effects happen right away.
Indeed, they did. It wasn't because I noticed in 2000, GMOs and pesticides, and the pesticides were introduced between 96 and 98. We were one of the first countries to introduce them. I think South Africa even beat us to it, but we were close regarding the release. And the spraying of glyphosate-based herbicides went up quickly. And then we started using it off-label as a crop desiccant. So children who were eating wheat, which already was problematic because of the hybridization of wheat, and kids could not tolerate that. They were getting leaky gut from this wheat they couldn't break down. Now we're getting exposed to the GMOs, which themselves are toxic, the glyphosate-based herbicides, and remember, glyphosate plus inerts, they're not, we know that, were making kids sicker quickly. And clearly there were some kids who were more at risk than others, but it started, boys are more sensitive, it appears, but it started really ramping up quickly because weeds became resistant to glyphosate-based herbicides rather quickly. And the last stat I saw was that approximately 75% of weeds in the US are now resistant to glyphosate-based herbicides, and there are over 800 formulations. And those inert substances, which are called POEAs, are surfactants, which are detergents that break down membranes so that the glyphosate can enter the cells and yet cause more harm.
Mm. Wow. Well, since I have your expertise and your clinical experience, I want you to break it down for folks because I guess I feel like people like you really made some changes in the way consumers were getting healthcare and what they were looking for in doctors and practitioners, maybe going outside of just the MDs. And so I'd like to, and there's so many things available now to diagnose. So I'd like to ask you first, what kinds of pesticides are you able to test for?
We can test for all the pesticides now. And even routine panels, when I mean routines, those are the ones that are uncovered by many insurance companies that you can guess through labs like Quest or LabCorp. Those are the two most common in the US. Will do pesticide panels. Glyphosate is not included on those panels, but you can get glyphosate tested by yourself through Health Research Institute. I want to say it costs $139, but please don't, maybe $134. But you can get your urine tested, you can get your water tested, you can get your breast milk tested, you can get your hair tested
Mm,
for glyphosate. And you have to order it separately, which is interesting to me. There are other labs that do it, like Mosaic. I think Henry Rowland's project, the Detox Project, does it. So you can test for glyphosate to see if you yourself have it. Now, glyphosate is water soluble. We should be able to urinate it out quickly. Some of us do, and some of us don't. So we're all not clearing these. We all don't have really functional detoxification pathways. This kind of care is very individualized. So we can test for it, but you can test for all the pesticides. What people need to know if they're eating non-organic produce, there are at least 6 pesticides per food, and those includes herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, right? Those are
mhm.
all under the category of pesticides. Some fungicides are even more toxic than the glyphosate-based herbicides. So very few studies on these combinations and the negative synergism on how these toxicants work together. They're more toxic together.
Right. So, what are the pesticides that you've most often found in your patients?
Yeah. So most often we find glyphosate because that is the most ubiquitously used herbicide globally. We'll find organic phosphates. The organic phosphates heavily used in let's say the Salinas Valley, and Dr. Brenda Eskenazi from UC Berkeley has been studying that in farm workers in the Salinas Valley, which is a growing region of California in the US. And she's been studying it for 20 years, has
Hmm.
a project called Chamacos, and she found significant health challenges to pregnant moms, babies born, and high rates of ADHD and other neurocognitive disorders in children from their exposure to organophosphates. Um, Paraquat, right now we're battling paraquat in the state of California. I'm trying to remove it, and we're not doing a great job. And the neonics, which are essentially decimating our bee population. So
Hmm.
those are the big groups that we're seeing, and we're seeing fungicides. I'll see in summertime a lot of methyl bromide and things they spray, let's say on strawberries, as a fungicide. So those are the main ones that you'll see, particularly in children.
And just in your experience, anecdotally, what sort of health problems are linked to the various pesticides? Have you been able to see patterns in that?
Yes, absolutely. So if we look at glyphosate based, what you'll see quickly is disruption of the microbiome. And what the microbiome is, that collection of organisms that sits in your gut, and your gut is literally an organ in itself, made up of a whole host of microbes that not only are responsible for 80% of your immune function, but also are your first line of detoxification, produce many of your vitamins like the B vitamins, and they also make the neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that run your brain. So glyphosate, let's start with that one, is an antibiotic. So it literally decimates the microbiome. When that microbiome shifts to a more toxic microbiome and the beneficial microbes are killed off, it affects the whole intestine. It's not just it just stays there. And what it does, is linked and caused to leaky gut. When those abnormal materials cross out of the gut and affect the blood brain barrier, glyphosate can shuttle various toxic metals like aluminum, which is in a lot of our baby foods. It's in
Mm,
100% of the infant formulas our groups tested, 100%, 40 formulas. And glyphosate shuttles aluminum into the brain 6 different ways. Additionally, a paper came out in 2022 that shows how glyphosate causes, not correlates, with autism. So we know it's an antibiotic. We know it's a causation factor of autism as well as asthma. Great paper out of Argentina on how glyphosate causes asthma,
mm,
now affecting anywhere from 1 in 5 kids in Puerto Rico, 1 in 9 kids, Mexican Americans. It's asthma, likely an autoimmune disease, common, but not benign. Just because we see it a lot doesn't make it benign. Additionally, glyphosate is a metal chelator, which means it binds minerals. So it makes those minerals that we need to run biologic functions like calcium, zinc, copper, magnesium, manganese, loves manganese, makes them unavailable. So
mm,
kids are working at a nutrient deficit. Even if their diet has adequate nutrients, which most Americans kids do not, most Americans don't, makes them unavailable. And eventually, enough glyphosate exposure will cause, not correlate, cancer.
mm.
And many people are familiar with the famous lawsuit that started here in Northern California with Mr. Dwayne Johnson in lymphoma. So that's super brief, and I don't want to go into too long, but I think did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was amazing. Very impressive. Yeah, and yeah, and brief, considering the amount of information you packed in. So, one of the stories in your book, "What's Making Our Children Sick," was a little girl, Zoe, and you had a situation where her exposure was environmental, and the neighborhood, it sounded like a nice neighborhood, was by vineyards, and then they found out that this field across the street from their house was just soaked in toxins. And so you had to figure out, you couldn't just say, okay, eat organic and you'll be good now. So you had to figure out how she could simultaneously detox these things as they tried to limit exposure as well as they could. So that was a complicated and fascinating case. So obviously if you want to lessen exposure, you eat organic, but I think for folks who do that and then they still have environmental exposure, you've had a lot of experience figuring out how to help the body detox better. What sort of strategies have you used with your patients?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing up the case of Zoe. That's not her real name, but the case is real. And I took a lot of heat on that case. The pediatrician reported me to the medical board at the job I was working at the time regarding the kid, care of that kid. Yes. So when you were speaking about that patient, that dear patient, and I remember her so well, I was getting goosebumps, like having PTSD. But
Mhm.
that was a challenge figuring out where her toxic exposures were coming from because that mom cleaned up that whole kitchen and I saw pictures of it. So, what to do? So, families then go through like pantry overhaul, right? They're just, clearing out organic regen food as much as families can, work within your budget, of course, but we try and do as much organic as we can. What happens when the environment is toxic? Like this gal was literally across the street. She had a toxic, it should have been a Superfund site across the street from her house. So they could not move, sure, move, right? But that's
Right.
not always an easy thing to do. They were unable to move for various reasons. So, what I say is, here are some tips. Number one, you take your shoes off at the door. Dust is often one of the most toxic things in your house, and you want to reduce dust exposure. Do not have the children do the vacuuming or the sweeping. Please have your kids do chores. Wash the dishes, but don't have them sweep and vacuum. And if parents should also consider wearing some kind of protection when they're sweeping or vacuuming or using a wet mop to get the dust so it's not being blown up, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So shoes at the door. Number two is you need to get HEPA filters, really good filters for your home. And, put them especially in the kids' room or where you're sleeping at night. And don't forget to change the filters in those HEPA filters. They have to be changed about every 6 months. And if you're in a toxic area, every 3 months. It's worth the investment and change the filter. Okay, so now you're doing that. If they are spraying your neighborhood, get involved. Stop the spray. They love spraying meridians. They love spraying parks. They love spraying hospitals. If you're in those areas, get them to stop. Talk to the vineyard across the street from your house or the farmers. My neighbor who lives right above me was spraying. She has since moved. Her yard, because again, something called sudden oak death with Roundup. Both of my dogs were drinking out of her irrigation tube, and both my dogs died of cancer. Just sharing a little anecdote.
So sorry.
Couldn't prove it, but I had a little conversation with that neighbor, and then they moved after we spoke. But I was very civil. Well, maybe not. Maybe a little agitated. Okay, I love my dogs. So okay, back to Zoe and what else we can do. The HEPA filters, you change them. But then there's you. So we're doing all that. I do believe kids need supplements too. You have to bring in supplements. The first thing you might have to do is change your diet and get them off inflammatory foods like gluten. It's often dairy. It may be soy, hopefully not eggs. I love eggs, grass-fed, free range, organic, regen chickens. So hard to do eggs, but you got to change their diets as kids' guts heal. Eat fermented foods. We change diets, bring in probiotics if ferments are just not working for your family, like sauerkraut and pickles. Kids tend to like that stuff, and you can make it really, really affordably. And I've actually, in my next book coming out, I actually talk about how to ferment. I taught myself how to ferment off of YouTube. It's not that hard. It's actually embarrassingly easy how to make
Well, I
sauerkraut.
mean, you did go to Yale, so
Well, they did. They didn't teach me that at Yale, though, how to ferment. I wish they had. That should be a course for me. But so we're doing all that, and then you might have to bring in supplements and stuff, homeopathics, herbals, various treatments to heal guts. But then there is a call to action here, Alexis. If you may not be doing what you do here at the People's Food Summit, but people can step up in their neighborhoods and in their schools. And I want to say schools because parents need to step in, because many schools are sprayed and they're not letting the parents know. We fought that here in California. But even if they give you a 24-hour notice, that they spray and then the kids are back on the field. It's sort of like, what are we doing here, people? So to stop spraying at your local school would be huge, because kids spend a lot of time at school in their classroom. And one of my patients recently was getting sick from carpets at his school and from mold and glue. And that mom, she's one of my coworkers and one of my partners, and I was able to write a letter for her in support of her son. She was able, with a team of parents, to pull out the carpets, clean up the classrooms, and they pitched in and bought HEPA filters for the classrooms. And the school went for it. Now, I'm not saying listen, I understand people's budgets and people can't go out buying HEPA filters for schools. But could you imagine if we did a kid-run school fundraiser to buy HEPA filters for classrooms, pulled out those moldy carpets and toxic carpets, and we stopped the spraying at schools? Right there, that would be huge. So this is an invitation for every parent, every eater to step up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Perro. People can follow your work at gmoscience.org.
Yes.
And they can look out for your new book, How to Make Children Well.
Yes, and might I add, is my last post on the website is the Pediatric Environmental Health Questionnaire. I created a questionnaire that I'm hoping to get at least 1,000 anonymous responses, and I've created 10 questions that can be done in 3 minutes and a scorecard on how many toxins and toxicants children are being exposed to, and I'm going to do a survey paper. So I'm starting to get a trickle of responses in, and I'm shooting for 1,000. 5,000 would even be better, and I'm going to tally them all up and publish it, share that information with both parents and medical practitioners, hopefully legislators.
Yeah, well, I think that the talk that you've given us really helps us understand what these environmental toxicants are. And I'm sure taking the survey also is a good reason to, it's a good way to learn more about what could be affecting our kids' health. Thank you so much. This is invaluable information. And Everybody needs this book on their bookshelf. It is the Bible for figuring out what's going on with your kids' health, what's making our children sick, by Dr. Michelle Perro. Thank you so much. Thanks for spending World Food Day with us.
Ah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.